and welcome back to another video feature of the Immersive Worlds Handbook. Today we are just outside of Cologne and Bonn, Germany at Phantasialand, and taking a tour today as part of a conference on theme parks, a project funded by the German government. So in addition to me walking around, I will be with a group of colleagues back here. And we'll be taking a tour today with Jan-Erik Steinkruger, who wrote his dissertation on Phantasialand. So we have one of the best guides certainly around to take us to the park. So I think what will be interesting for us today to consider is the nature of the theme. You can see behind us here the African themed hotel, and I think one of the things we'll be looking at as a group today is the nature of cultural representations that are noted in some of the theme lands that we see, some of the rides and so forth. But I have to say, just initially, looking around and scanning, I'm really impressed with what I'm seeing. Some people have described it as a rather small theme park, but I'm so far quite pleasantly surprised. So let's start the tour today here at Phantasialand, just outside of Bonn in Cologne, Germany. Alright, so as I'm doing this tour through Phantasialand today, I should mention the bigger context why I was in Germany for this visit. It's part of a new project which is funded by the German government. It is so far taking place at the university in Bonn and also at JGU, Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz, and perhaps also through Heidelberg University. So we're part of a group here studying theme parks, and this is our tour beginning on our visit to Phantasialand. Jan-Erik Steinkruger, who has written his dissertation and knows probably more than anyone academically about Phantasialand. So he was beginning the tour today talking here, showing us one of the old maps of Phantasialand, and then on the left, one of the graduate students has one of the newer maps. And that was actually a nice moment to be able to take these two maps as we walk through the park and to compare and contrast the past and the present. You know, one of the things that gets forgotten, I think, in theme parks is the change. You know, in a sense, we inhabit theme parks in the moment in which we visit them or study them, but I think it's very important. In my work at Six Flags Astroworld, the same thing. I saw a lot of change during the time I was there. These are just some images we took, and you'll see some of these coming back in the theme lands and our trip through Phantasialand. But I'm beginning with this overall context because it was such an innovative opportunity. We'll talk about this a little bit later, looking at one of the rides in one of the theme lands, an opportunity to look at it from a theater studies or performance studies standpoint in terms of the ride staging. We were just standing at the gate, getting our tickets ready to go in, and Jan-Erik was talking a little bit about the challenges of building and maintaining this theme park in terms of limited space and the fact that you cannot build outside the perimeter here. And a little bit later we'll look at some of the homes that are almost just right buttressed up against Phantasialand. So we'll begin the tour here walking through Berlin, and essentially there are six theme lands that we'll be looking at. Berlin here is the focus, and it has a specific temporal era of the 1920s. And there was a lot of discussion in our group about, who decides on what themes to choose, and in this case, why do you decide on picking a particular era? What are some of the reasons for that? What if there's a particular political or social or cultural connotation connected to a given theme land or a given theme, and that's always an issue. By the way, I'll say today, not my best video moments. The camera is full of artifacts. I didn't clean my lens and things are bouncing around, so you'll have to I guess just deal with that as we take the tour. It's one of the facets of doing these run and gun videos is sometimes you don't have an opportunity to do the most professional looking video. But again, the point of this video and many others is to give you an overview and to raise some issues and hopefully stimulate some discussion about, in this case, a theme park in Germany. And I think a very good theme park. I have to say, some people were sort of saying to me like, well, don't expect too much, and they were sort of downplaying, I think, the experiences. I actually thought there were so many wonderful moments, and I'll take you through many of those today. Now, as we're walking through this part of Berlin, the 1920s, This has the classic theme park trope. What would you say this is? It's Main Street, right? Disney's Main Street, USA. So many theme parks around the world use this trope. A trope simply meaning an approach in this case. It's something common we see in theme parks. If you go to Universal parks, you actually see some of this, where you see different main streets. In some cases in Universal Studios Singapore, you see multiple main streets. So I guess I'll give you a little bit of background about the theme park itself. And, one of the things I would advise you to do is, if you travel and if you visit theme parks like Phantasialand, or another one is Europa Park, which I've visited in the past, is to really look into the history. So this park opened in 1967, attracts nearly 1.75 million visitors annually. And because it has this family focus, not unlike Europa Park, which is connected to the Mack family, very famous for their ride manufacturing, amazing rides, I think it's refreshing to see parks like this at Phantasialand and also Europa Park, because essentially we're living in an era these days in which we experience the theme park. The theme park experience is conveyed through corporate branding, through the various forms of transmedia. So if you go to any Disney park or Universal Park today, it's the Harry Potter experience, or it is some superhero action experience, or it is, of course, Star Wars or Avatar at Disney's Animal Kingdom. So I think for me, the nostalgia effect of visiting a theme park like Phantasialand was that it allowed me to look at some attractions in a different sense. You will see later, particularly with the Hollywood ride, some, I don't want to say decaying rides, but rides that are showing age and time, and brings up the unfortunate topic of some fires. And actually there was a fire recently at Europa Park, and I'll have to cover that when I do a video on Europa Park. But 2001, there was a massive fire at Phantasialand, and we'll see some of the theme land later, which essentially, this is a kind of grainy shot I found online, but essentially there was a wooden roller coaster, and I'm not entirely clear on how it got caught in fire, but there were people on the ride and there were evacuations, and I think over 60 people were injured. Fortunately, there weren't any deaths. This is an aftermath shot you could see of this, and we're in front of that Mystery Castle, and this is a lot of this is in the mystery area, the Klugheim area, so we'll look at some of that a little bit later, but never like to see that. But there's a history here again where over time you adapt and you change things and you recreate, presumably with the guest in mind. So I'm showing you some of this, and again, as I mentioned earlier, I think the trope of Main Street USA we see present here. The difference is that you're walking through essentially 1920s Berlin. There were some performers. I only noted them here. I also noted the mascots. If I have an image of that, I'll show you that later. So, like any theme park that you visit around the world, you see things like performers. In this case, connected to the theme land itself. So they're connected to that, and they have that sense of fitting in, right? It's part of the attraction. You have rides, and of course you have attractions, and all those fit within these vehicles that we call theme lands. And theme lands, of course, are the most important aspect, you would say, of the modern theme park after Disneyland and also Six Flags Over Texas, because with both of those parks, they really did show us, Walt Disney and Angus Wynn showed us that it's important to orient the guests in space through what I've often talked about as forms of three-dimensional storytelling. So very important certainly for the history of the theme park as we consider today here at Phantasialand. Well, now as we're looking a little bit more at the Berlin 1920s theme land, it might be important for me just to mention the 6 theme lands. Again, Berlin is the name of the land, and we're in it now, and the theme is Berlin in the 1920s. I've done a actually video of one of the attractions here called the Verrückte Hotel Tartuffe, which is a very cool funhouse. Check out my separate video on that. We'll look at next, I believe, Wutztown, which is their own intellectual property, and the theme, as I've understood it, is fantasy. And in that theme land, we'll look at the Hollywood ride, as I mentioned, Temple of the Nighthawk, and some of the other attractions that I think has a more childlike theme. We'll go through Mexico and look at some of the rides there. We'll look at a mystery slash Kugheim, which is a theme land whose theme is mystery and includes the Mystery Castle and a lot of the new Viking theming, which I'll talk about in some depth because it has a lot of backstory to it. Two other theme lands, Chinatown, the theme is China. There's a ride that we'll hopefully go through, which is kind of an interesting ride. And then Deep in Africa, the theme is Africa. There's the Black Mamba roller coaster. And I should say Chinatown and Deep in Africa both have themed hotels that are worth seeing if you go to Phantasialand. And in fact, I have a separate video where I talk about cultural representation at Phantasialand, some of the controversies, issues of stereotyping. I advise you to check out those two videos because I go into much more depth there about both the African hotel and the Chinese hotel. And we were looking there a little more at our research group. So again, we just had a look at the Berlin section. I'm showing on the map there just so you get a sense here. This is the most current Phantasialand. Again, Jan Erik has that historic one that maybe will pop up in some other images, but it was really cool having that because we could really do this comparison of looking at how a theme park changes over time, how it adapts, how it rethemes, how it alters things. So we're looking first, we're going to take a left and go into the Woodstown, which again has a fantasy theme and has really a lot of the original intellectual property that is specific to the park. And you won't see at this park, for example, and we'll begin this tour here talking a little bit about theming. They have this new steampunk ride that's coming out that looks kind of cool. But as we pan up here and look at some of the rides, there's a pretty cool feel to some of this. They already have like a steampunk, if I could say it, aesthetic going on, as you can see with the girders there. And this new ride, which looks like it's going to be really cool, I think. So I like this, the focus on steampunk. It's I think a very cool one. If you watch, there was a show years ago, you might be able to find it on Netflix, but it was on essentially steampunk, and it was trying to get people to create their own rooms, their designs and so forth. Kind of a cool reality show I happened to see years ago. Now, one of the things you're going to notice when we go into this ride here, I think we're going to go into kind of this structure here, is that again, as Jan Erik was talking about when we did our first tour, this park is limited. They cannot expand for various reasons. There's protected land. There's also, as you'll see a little bit later, a housing community. They can't expand horizontally, right? They can't expand the perimeter of the park. So what's the one option? You have to go up or down, right? It would be pretty expensive to create, attractions underground. But one of the things they do is they create these vertical attractions that you're going to see. And I think it's a creative opportunity to think about some challenges with theme parks from that standpoint of design, from that standpoint of infrastructure, just the practical things about how a theme park relates to the surrounding environment. And we're looking at their original IP, as you can see on one of these posters, and I think we'll jump to some maybe have some video here. Looks like I did it in slow-mo. But as I'm panning up here, I think you'll get an appreciation of that sense of verticality. Just look at this attraction. And this is essentially indoors. There's some fabric canopies there. I think it's a very creative use of space. It's just a cool, it reminds me of something more like you'd see, in the Mall of America, or a very large mall, or maybe the I'm thinking of the casino in Las Vegas, Circus with some of the attractions there, because it just has more of that enclosed feel. And of course, you look at some of the, you look at the roof here. Obviously, there isn't a facade there, right? I mean, when the guest looks at some of this, it has a pure structural, non-thematic sort of focus. And some of that could be for practicality. I think when you tour Phantasialand today on our video feature here, look at this ride here. There's some really cool attractions, I have to say, at Phantasialand, some of the newer rides. Just really cool ride vehicles, delivery systems, theming, as you're going to see as we're talking about here. But I think with a park like Phantasialand, if they don't have as much capital to invest in intellectual property, like if you wanted to license and get, some sort of action hero movie, you want to get some German intellectual property that's not connected to anything that the family or the corporation here at Phantasialand owns, that's very, very, very expensive, and there's negotiations that you have to deal with. It's not as easy as, say, Disney, because they own and bought out Lucasfilms. They now have access to that intellectual property. It's not always the case. There's actually an issue with one of the, I think it's DC and Universal and Disney, and this whole issue of who can use it where, and that's kind of another issue for another time. But in terms of theming, of course, one of the issues that we have to consider in our group, as you can see here, is we're taking some photos and videos as we're touring. And it was really cool actually have that opportunity to talk to other theme park professionals and people from the industry and folks who study it academically, because it gave us an opportunity to think about things both in an academic perspective and also in a more practical perspective. You're seeing a little more of that verticality as you look at some more of the rides here in this theme land. And, for me, when I'm studying theming, I'm always asking questions about why was a particular theme chosen and so forth. Again, reiterating here this issue of verticality. I'm calling out a few issues today. I'll call out the theme lands and then also like some of the issues that are connected to the tour today. So we're looking here, and Jan Erik gave us a really interesting overview, which I wish you could have heard, but I had a chance to hear it. And if you're looking there in the distance, I think you'll see some homes, and we're taking photos. We'll zoom in a little bit here. And so what's fascinating about this verticality, and there's a ride right here. I didn't get to go on it. It's essentially a boat ride, and kind of pointing out the home there, some of the homes. Jan Erik basically said that there was an issue with noise and some of the local residents, and so that's always a concern, I think, is to think about the effect of the theme park on the outer areas. In this case, it's so close, buttressing the other the non-theme park areas with the homes and other areas. We already passed it, but that was one of the other original intellectual property moments, and that was one of their mascots, which is this dragon, and you actually see that represented in the Fantasia there at the top of the map. So now we're going to go, so coming in from Berlin, if we take a right, we'll enter into the Mystery and Klugheim area. And this one I think is very interesting. If you have to pick, I guess, a top theme land, it might be this one. I think equally interesting. The Asian theming, the Chinatown, has, I would say, a somewhat dated feel to it, although if you go into their amazing hotel, which is I think a 5-star hotel, that certainly has outstanding theming. Deep in Africa, the African theme land is recent as a theme land and also hotel, but I think the theming maybe doesn't come off as convincing as this here. So this, in a sense for me, has sort of two areas. There's the Mystery Castle, which I'll show you later, which is an older ride. The roller coasters here that you're going to see are all relatively new, the last couple years, and they call this Klugheim. And if you read online, what a lot of people would say, and even if you don't read online, if you just visit the park, again, when I visited, I thought, this reminds me of like Vikings. It reminds me of Game of Thrones in terms of some of that aesthetic. When we go into the tavern, there's a character there who Gollum from Lord of the Rings, and you'll see that in a second. I'm confusing monsters, but it happens to the best of us. So you're seeing the aesthetic here. It has this real Norse Viking theme to it. I think I'll show you a shot later, but if we were to pan up, that wall is very massive and high, and again, it's a practical thing. It has an environmental effect, I would have to say, as a guest visiting Phantasialand, but it also does provide a sound barrier and a visual barrier from the surrounding area. Because this is so close to homes and the surrounding non-theme park areas, it's important for them to really think about how to protect, the outside world, because obviously that'd be a concern if you lived right next to Phantasialand. You'd be concerned about the noise, and I guess you'd also be concerned about if you're sitting in your backyard and you see the theme park, it's just, maybe visually not something you want to see. And by the way, I think that'd be interesting if someone did a study of, like, in Anaheim near Disneyland, at Walt Disney World, there's nothing like this. Other than the hotels and employee areas, there isn't, like a community that's literally right next to the theme park. And Jan Erik is telling us a little more there about just this attraction, this theme land, and the creation of it. But that makes it quite unique if you think about it. If you just think about this facet of how a theme park negotiates, if it's very close to other non-theme park entities, businesses, homes, communities, how does it negotiate that relationship? I mean, it's an issue of really politics, of economics, of community planning, and so forth. And I think that's one of the fascinating things about Phantasialand that you won't see at a lot of other theme parks. I'm trying to think of other theme parks that have that connection. Again, Anaheim and Disneyland, there's a very close relationship there. If you read about, Disneyland in the paper lately, there have been issues about, well, I won't get into it here, but, check out the paper. There's a lot of issues that people have been talking about. My exposure is a little crazy today. Apologize for that, but you're getting, I think, a sense of the appeal of the theme land. For me, it was one of the most, enveloping, I think, of the theme lands. It sort of does really tie you in. One of the things about Phantasialand that I think is so interesting, and we just reunited with some of our other comrades. They were actually riding different rides, and we caught up with them in the same theme land. But one of the cool things about Phantasialand and what they're doing, I think very effectively with their theming and their attractions, is it's a relatively small theme park. When you walk through a given theme land, they're not big. I mean, it reminds me in size a little bit of Paris Disneyland in terms of it's a smaller theme park. I don't offhand, you could check online to see the acreage, but I'd be curious to look into that. So now I found this on the Phantasialand website. This is Klugheim again, this mystery theme land. And what was really cool was just the level of, I don't know if I call this backstory or more like their sensibilities about creating this theme land. So they say here are some of the world statements about the theming before the opening. So you can see very positive reflections here. And then if you click, so go to the Phantasialand website and then click on this particular Klugheim theme land, and they have all these magazine articles. It talks about the inspiration of the theme land, the land of volcanoes. It talks about creating a lot of the goods that are for sale, or perhaps part of the costuming created for the employees. It talks a little bit about some of the woodworking, which you can see here at Phantasialand. In many of their theme lands, including Africa and China, they spend a lot of time on creating this stuff. It's quite amazing from an aesthetic artistry standpoint. There's the show I'm talking about. So you see just that backdrop that is essentially a sound and visual barrier. Here's our friend here. Again, I'm not saying there's any relationship to Lord of the Rings, but it kind of reminded me a little bit of Gollum in Lord of the Rings. I almost said Grendel again, actually. Here's inside the tavern, and you get a little bit of that feel, again, the Viking, the ruins and stuff. And just, I think, overall, a really cool theme land. If you look at some of the woodworking here outside, some of the attractions, very compact. I think you get that sense, right? You get that sense of how compact this theme park is. I'm kind of kicking myself for not checking out the Mystery Castle. And this is a very historic ride, and essentially what it is you walk through this castle, and then it's one of these, I guess almost like Tower of Terror, which is no longer Tower of Terror, it's Guardians of the Galaxy. But it's that type of ride that shoots you up and you fall down, and I think it kind of has a cool look to it, and I'm disappointed I didn't get a chance to visit it, because it's one of those, I think, rides that probably would stand out as really different than other theme park rides out there. And that's one of the purposes of the visit here and doing this video, is to really talk about some of the differences that we note when we visit a theme park, not just in Germany, but maybe a theme park that doesn't fall within that typical, as I mentioned earlier, corporate landscape in terms of thinking about all the IP, all the transmedia. You're going to experience Star Wars in all its glory in a theme land. But while it's amazing from a fan's perspective, from someone who's viewing all the transmedia potentials of, say, Star Wars or Harry Potter, the other side of it is limits what you can do in the theme park. If the guest is now expecting that every theme park is a transmedia phenomenon in terms of the theme lands, the rides, and the attractions, we're entering Mexico, by the way, if you can figure that out, then I think there's a limitation in terms of the possibilities of what that guest can experience. So this is the Mexico theme land. It has kind of a lot of different feels of Mexico. I mean, you can look at the architecture and get a sense of what is being done here. If I take you through a couple of the rides, I think possibly if we have I know I went on the flume ride, and I'm trying to remember if I have some video or stills coming up of it, so we'll have to see. We'll check that out in a second. And we'll come back to this ride later as part of our theme park studies seminar, which, as I mentioned earlier, was a great opportunity to look at theme parks in this like group setting, doing what many of us call creative research. You're getting a pan here of some of the environs around Mexico. You see on the left there, part of the Africa theme land. We'll get to that later. Let me now give you my on-site commentary on retail issues at Phantasialand. Yeah, so we're taking a trip through one of the main gift shops here at Phantasialand, and I was saying as we were getting off some of the rides that in a typical American theme park, you would see the old classic exit through the gift shop, and you'd get off a ride, and there'd be things that were themed in accordance with the ride, and you don't really see that here at Phantasialand. And in this main gift shop, the other thing that one of the participants in our seminar said is that you don't get a lot of the same kind of intellectual property. It seems to be very specific, right, to the park itself, so you don't have that IP transmedia effect that's really common in a lot of theme parks these days, at least in the United States and certainly in some parts of Europe as well. And so, as I've said then in that reflection on site that I recorded and also some of my earlier commentary, I think it's always interesting, if you go to a theme park, if you're studying theme parks, to take a stop in some of the gift shops, because it really does say a lot about not just the theming, the attractions. I mean, it's a common thing in theme parks today to, exit through the gift shop. So I remember working at Six Flags Astroworld at the Batman ride, and if you exited the ride, you could go into a gift shop that had the various Batman memorabilia and so forth. And the uniqueness of Phantasialand is that they have so much of really all of it, right? Their intellectual property is done in-house, so that allows them to do some unique things. It allows them to have some identity and creativity that you wouldn't get in the world of transmedia. And at the same time, it's saving money, because licensing is both, a pro and a con in terms of thinking about the potential revenue, but then what you have to pay for it is another matter. So we'll talk about some rides now. So we're actually back in, I guess we'll break from the theme lands a little bit, but this is in Woodstown. And this is an old style ride. It's one of these, you get on a boat and you go through a series of dioramas. At the beginning of the attraction, it's supposed to be Alfred Hitchcock. And one of the things about this ride is that you get the sense of datedness in terms of just some of the movie properties that are mentioned. It has, I guess Alfred Hitchcock, you would say, has a very famous history, so he's maybe a good place to start with, but probably for a lot of younger people, they're maybe not, unfortunately, familiar with Hitchcock films. Okay, so I'll have to take a look here at the experience. I'm trying to, so I kind of just threw the video on here, so we have a little bit of a like a flume experience, and this is unedited, so it's raw. It has maybe some errors and stuff, so we'll just go through the ride, I think probably in real time. So one thing I will say about this, and I mentioned it earlier, is that there is a sort of dated feel to this ride, and I think on the one hand, for the theme park guest of today, the expectation is that every ride will have that technological high-tech appeal of, let's say, like the Pandora theme land, going on the Avatar, Flight of Passage, which I've done a video on. You should check that out. But that's an expectation, and a ride like that is like so expensive. Again, one of the things I don't like about the theme park industry, and as we go along, maybe you can guess the theme references here. This will be Jaws, I believe, that we're looking at. And it was cool, having you on Eric, because he could tell us what to check out and what to look out for in terms of some of the sites we were seeing. You see the shark there, right? So, one of the things I'll talk about later is ride, there it is, Jaws, right? Or a version of it. no claim that it's Jaws, but it's a shark. And of course, there's a level of intertextuality. We'll talk about this later. That happens on any of these rides. For example, you go to Europa Park, the Piraten in Batavia ride, which I think, unfortunately, was the area where that fire just happened not too long ago in 2018. But there's an intertextuality to rides. So if you have a ride that has pirates in it, and you're on a boat, and there's song, and there's swashbuckling adventures, that immediately will refer to Pirates of the Caribbean, or perhaps at another level refer to the Pirates of the Caribbean movies that came after the Disney ride, which was an interesting article, I should point out, in the new reader I did in Themed Immersive Spaces, getting into intertextuality of all the Pirates of the Caribbean video games and rides and, of course, movies and so forth. As we're looking here, I believe, so there's a famous, someone know that? There's a famous kind of like, isn't it like a spaghetti western plus a monster movie where there's like a giant spider that people fight in the desert, if I'm recalling. I can't think of it right now, so I'm assuming maybe that's the reference there. Again, some of the references I think you're seeing in this Hollywood ride are kind of dated, right? And so on the one hand, yeah, they're not the most current movies, and for a lot of guests maybe they won't even get the references, but on the other hand, there's something I think nostalgic about some of these scenes that you see, the attractions. Now this probably is this Sinbad or is this a Mummy reference? I'm trying to look and see what it is here. But I think you see that again, and there's kind of like a cool effect, right? You get that like pillar that's falling down on the ride. And that's always cool in a lot of these style of rides. You know, some of the Universal Studios, the old rides like Confrontation and so forth, had these kinds of effects, and they're always kind of fun. Again, when you look at something like this, and you can see the cord, right? So, like, in a sense, you say it's breaking that suspension of disbelief that we have. But on the other hand, it's kind of like, you know, when you're a kid and you want to know how a magician does the magic trick, right? There's kind of a fun to seeing that, to breaking down that barrier between the performance and the audience. And I don't know, kind of cool. This is is it a Bride of Frankenstein or a Frankenstein thing? And Jan Erik pointed out there was a bit of a, I don't know if you're going to get this, but an error in terms of Dr. Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster, but I didn't like get that entirely. And there could be the Bride of Frankenstein, I don't know, falling down from the ceiling. So it kind of has that old funhouse horror appeal to it, you know, that's kind of fun for kids and so forth. So I don't know what you think about this. I don't know your opinion on this. If you go and visit an old ride, like if you go to a state fair, if you're in the United States, you know, the state fair tradition, sometimes you would have these haunted houses or these dark rides that were kind of cool and nostalgic, but no one ever was going to say like, wow, these are the best rides, because they just immerse you in a multi-sensory perspective that you get at, say, Flight of Passage, which again is tens of millions of dollars more expensive than anything we'd see here or at a state fair. So this is, I believe, Jules Verne type thing, it looks like, perhaps. And it has, you know, this actually, it reminded me of that, I just love this scene right here. I just love how this, you know, happens visually if you look at this. What was that Bill Murray movie? The Life Aquatic, I think, was the one. Just the way they did the special effects in that film has that unique look to it. It's kind of like if you see claymation today, some of the folks doing claymation videos today, the freeze, the stop action animation, it's just so cool and different and almost jarring visually when you look at it than, say, you know, the classic CGI stuff you get in movies. So some of this, I have to say, is really quite, you know, it's innovative today. I don't know, I'm going to say it. Maybe it's the nostalgia. Maybe it's like it looks so different and it doesn't look like the latest, greatest attractions that we see in other theme parks that, for me, makes it stand out in the crowd. And I think that is, I think it was Tarzan, right? Is that right? I think that was Tarzan. I'm sure somebody online has the play-by-play, like they probably have a map drawn out of all the dioramas here that you see all the various movie media moments in Hollywood. So if you have that, you can definitely comment here. You never know what people will have online as we go through more of the ride. You can see this is a really long ride, and that's the other thing I liked about it. I think is a lot of rides. I did the new Navi ride, and that one again at Pandora was really quite short. I mean, it was just a relatively short ride compared to this one. And of course, we see here the famous Wizard of Oz. It's pretty easy to identify. Makes me think a little bit of the old MGM in Las Vegas and the Wizard of Oz theming that was part of that casino at one time in the past. Incidentally, in 2007, they replaced, it became the Wizard of Oz. In the past, there was a reference to presumably Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, and there was a image or a scene of a woman being attacked by ravens. And so that got changed over time. Now we're coming up on King Kong, and it'll be worth noting here. You'll see some of the just some of the effects of time on Kong as you look at just the ride here. You'll see just some of this. I would say there are quite a few references here we could consider. Certainly the old Universal Florida in Orlando ride, Kongfrontation, which I remember riding. That actually opened in 1990, closed in 2002. And I mention that because this particular Hollywood, it's sometimes called a Hollywood tour, though the sign on the outside just says Hollywood. This opened in 1990 as well. So kind of, a point of reference there to think about. The other one I'm reminded of from a, not specific to King Kong, but is the old Disney Studios ride, the Great Movie Ride, which I thought was pretty cool in some respects. And that opened in 1989. And so I'm mentioning some of this, and as we, consider a little bit more here today, the issue of intertextuality, certainly, when there's a successful ride at one park, it sometimes gets translated at another park. And I think it always brings up the issue of ride copies and what exactly that means. And I'm always curious about things like licensing and how that works in terms of, using something like King Kong here when clearly, this particular theme park doesn't own the rights maybe to the King Kong story or King Kong merchandise. So a bit beyond my level of expertise in terms of, looking at brands and copies and rights and things of that nature. But I think it's something interesting to think about as you consider this phenomenon in which one ride becomes adapted or remade in a new cultural context at a different theme park. Okay, and that's actually the end of the tour of Hollywood. I was mentioning earlier this issue of ride intertextuality, and we're looking here at the Temple of the Nighthawk. And I learned from Jan-Erik Steinkruger that this ride used to be a space theme ride, and I think in my next slide you'll see us walking up the queuing area. And I forget the name of that previous version, but essentially this ride is very reminiscent of Space Mountain. It's in in the dark roller coaster, so it has that kind of it's actually, I would say, fairly impressive. It's an older ride, but pretty interesting in the respect that it gives you that visceral sensibility as you're going through darkness on the ride. I should mention when I worked at Astroworld, we had a ride called the Mayan Mindbender, which was kind of interesting and also in the dark roller coaster. And not unrelated is a Mayan theme here, Telecon. And this is a ride that I think is probably the most visually interesting ride in the park. And I think in a second I'll have some more slides coming up from our theme park studies group. One of our researchers in the group has actually done quite a bit of focus on this particular ride, and she was discussing with us the issue of staging and audiences, and how specifically there's this sort of dual audience effect where the people are spinning around here and they're looking at us and we're looking at them. So there's this very interesting focus on staging. I just have to say, and this is named, by the way, this is in the Mexico theme land. It's named after a Mayan god of rain, fertility, and water, as you can maybe gather from the name of the ride. This particular ride is one of those that I think is really fascinating, pretty amazing, just thinking about it in a mechanical sense. So that has its own visual appeal. But then how they've created the structure here, they've brought in a lot of the elements. So there's heat, there's water, you see like a rainbow effect there. And it's one of these that is just, I think, just a visually attractive ride. And the theming, the way they've constructed with the glyphs and everything else, this Mayan theme, I think is quite amazing, including this breakage, if you will, on the sides of the ride vehicle. And you can see here a little bit, our team is looking at the ride, and we're having again this extended conversation about how this ride operates in a visual sense. And so yeah, for me this was one of the highlight rides, I would say, as we went through the park. It's one of these, I think, I don't know if you've ridden rides like these. They're not my favorite. I've always loved roller coasters and dark rides and simulators. These, like pure kinetic rides, I think it takes a certain kind of person maybe who wants to ride these. It's very cool with the fire effect as well. Again, I would say if you're going through the entire park of Phantasialand, this is maybe the one ride that has like such a visual sense to it that it allows you to maybe to take a picture, and you have an iconic representation, I think, of a very attractive ride. So here's a little more of our team, and this was very cool. Again, I mentioned at the beginning of this video how we spent a day together. It was actually a great break from our theme park studies conference, and it allowed us to do this in situ, on-site consideration of rides, attractions. I should say it was, other than that initial moment where Jan Eric talked about the maps where we were in Old Berlin, we split up into different groups, and it was essentially pretty random. So there wasn't really any order to that. And I think we all just selected maybe rides that we wanted to go on. And after I had been in a few different groups, I sort of thought, oh, I should have gone with this other group because they did more of the roller coasters, and I realized I didn't really ride. I did the one sort of runaway train ride, but that was it. So I kind of wish I had maybe done a little more of the visceral roller coasters during my visit. But again, just a neat opportunity here to look at this ride and to take in some considerations of its particular appeal. I think one of the things that we could talk about or consider here as we're talking about theme parks in general, I mentioned earlier one big issue was the topic of intellectual property and transmedia. The other issue to consider is just the fascination we have with rides. I was doing a show some time back, a radio interview for the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Company, and they interviewed me specifically about a ride that was no longer going to be a very historic ride, that wasn't going to be at one of the big fairs there. And they asked me to talk a little bit about that and also discuss just the history of rides. And I made a point of saying that some of the older rides that you see at places like Blackpool, Pleasure Beach, and so forth, Noah's Ark, comes to mind there, that we're missing out on some of those attractions because essentially we are maybe taken with simulator rides. We're focused on the technology behind rides, and we're also focused on the idea, again, of the intellectual property. We want to ride a ride that has some connection to a movie or a video game or some famous film, media property out there. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, but I think there's a challenge when you're trying to do something a little different with what I noted here at the rides at Phantasialand. So I had on the map there the indication that we're entering into Chinatown. And this is, again, along with Africa, or Deep in Africa as it's called, which is maybe a bit of an unfortunate name there. This is one of the very explicit, more place-based theming. Again, we can get into a whole conversation about what goes into creating places in theme park representations of the world and of cultures and specific architectural and aesthetic forms and folkways. But a point here, I think, is to transport guests to other places through imagination, through staging, through use of architecture and design, and of course the various attractions that we all love and enjoy. And the ride we're looking at right now is from Fengju Palace. And basically the premise behind it is there's a show at the beginning. I actually tried to get some photos, but they said I couldn't take the photography. So, but at the end there's sort of this tipping attraction that you ride on. It's kind of cool, good for families. And this next one is Geisterrichka, and this is described as Europe's largest underground dark ride. And it has, I think, some riffing off of some of the scenes in the Haunted Mansion from Disney's famous ride. Looking a little more here at the theming here in the Asian or Chinatown theme area. Again, you might want to check out my video I did on their very nice hotel, their themed hotel. We're getting a sense here both in these last two theme lands in terms of the China area and in Africa. A sense of combining multiple attractions, theming throughout the Themeland hotel, and also, not just decor, but food and so forth that goes along with the theming. So you can see here we're looking at the newest theme land, which is Africa here. And I have to say, along with the Asian theming in Chinatown, it definitely is impressive. Now, when you look at it from the perspective of cultural politics, which some of our group did when we were touring, maybe you arrive at some different conclusions, and I think there's a lot to consider in terms of those issues. I advise you to take a look at my video on cultural representation at Phantasialand, because I delve really deeply into both the African theme land and the Chinese theme line here at Phantasialand. I think one of the interesting things about it from a cultural standpoint is that it's called Deep in Africa. And unfortunately, we know that with Africa, with certainly Orientalism, with various Asian cultures, we often get exoticism, we often get stereotyping that is accompanying the representations. And this certainly has happened before, well before, the world of theme parks. In fact, in the late 2010s here in pop culture, there's a lot of discussion worldwide. I see it all the time on social media relative to cultural appropriation. There could be a fashion show. It could be an individual like Rachel Dolezal, who you may remember from her infamy claiming to be an African American just because of affect or desire and so forth. And I think it's always a question, right, with any kind of cultural remaking when we recreate a place, however we do it, if it's in a theme park, if it's in a museum, in the world of art, or in a fashion show, we have to ask, I believe, some critical questions. Now, that being said, when you come to a theme park, you don't necessarily expect to have critical discourse going on about cultural representation. This is something I noted in that other video, and I said, you have gumbo, which we would associate with Creole, with Louisiana cuisine and so forth. We wouldn't associate with Africa. So, these issues I think are very relevant when we start thinking about the politics of representation. Now, from a pure visual perspective, I think you would say that the theming here in the African theme land is very involved. It's incredibly, it's almost like inch by inch. When you go into the hotel here in particular, you come into this display of so much theming, it's almost like maybe they needed to tone some of it down, just because I think it gets a little overwhelming perhaps to the guest. So we'll leave the African theme land, and I'll leave you with some final comments here recorded during my tour at Phantasialand. I hope you enjoyed the video feature today here, focusing on Phantasialand, a very interesting theme park in Germany that you should certainly visit if you're near Bonn or Cologne. Please come back for additional video features of the Immersive World's Handbook.